Meagan, welcome to the Girls for Greatness podcast. It's so wonderful to have you here. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today about a topic, as I kind of said in my intro, that I think is going to be so relatable to so many women listening in. And I really thank you for taking the time to talk to us about something that I know is near and dear to your heart and something that you're super passionate about.
I am. I thank you so much for having me here, Delia.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Well, tell us where you're located in the world and maybe even a little about how you got into this line of work, how you got into nutrition.
I live in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is just kind of in the center of the state between the mountains and the beach. I live here with my husband and my two daughters who are 5 and 9, and finally both in school in school together, both in elementary school. So I'm enjoying this new chapter of life where people are kind of on a similar schedule. It's fantastic.
Yes.
I got into this line of work for kind of like a growing interest over time. I had a biology degree, and I actually worked in a lab and then worked in pharmaceutical sales for a number of years, representing products that were for chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension. And I had kind of minored in nutrition in my undergrad work. And it always been an area of interest. And obviously, when you talk about chronic diseases, one of the things that comes up often is this conversation about lifestyle changes. So my interest in that just continued to grow as I listened to physicians talk about the conversations with their patients. And I eventually felt like what I was supposed to do was quit my job and go back to school. I felt like I wanted to make a different kind of impact than what I was doing on the pharmaceutical side of things. And that was my primary purpose, but there's been twists and turns since then. So I kind of thought, I'm going to go into school. I'm going to help people on this journey of treating chronic disease, which often weight loss is a primary recommendation for that, right? So I kind of pictured partnering in journey for folks being able to take care of themselves in treatment and prevention of chronic diseases. And what I learned along the way in getting my master's and then actually practicing with like live human beings and there were real life human beings was that these things aren't quite so textbook. And this idea of that you can eat in this kind of certain way that results in weight loss and then everything's better. I was seeing in practice wasn't actually the best way to help people focus on health. And one of the most impactful contributors to that was that I started also treating folks with eating disorders. And there was a need for that in our community. And I started getting referrals from another dietitian that specialized in eating disorders. She actually works with me now in my practice. Wow. And that's how I got introduced to treating folks with eating disorders. And then I saw, well, gosh, not only does this not necessarily add up to health, like weight loss wasn't necessarily resulting in health, and certainly not sustainable health, but also like there is a darker side to it in that folks that are predisposed to eating disorders are getting their eating disorders triggered by this language. And it is not as significant implications to it because eating disorders are the number one cause of death amongst mental health illnesses. And so it was like, once I saw it, Delia, I couldn't unsee it. And this whole entire experience kind of informed my practice going forward, which is informed by intuitive eating and health at every size concepts, which people are always like, well, what does that mean? And I kind of break it down to say, like, from cake to kale, I feel like all foods are important and all foods are good foods, and that you can't determine somebody's health by their body shape or size. We can't see somebody who's in a smaller body, the one that our kind of diet-oriented culture idealizes, and say, that person's got it. They're healthy. They don't have to worry about anything. They've got it. And we can't look at somebody that's in a much larger body and say, you know what, that person's unhealthy. They need to change their body.
That's great. I love that. And I want to dive into that. I have two questions really quick that just popped in my mind. So when you were in the pharmaceutical side, did that have anything to do with like diet culture, or like, were those drugs that you were, or the company you were part of, was it in that realm of, or was it something totally different?
You mean, were they like weight loss drugs?
Yeah.
No, they were not at that time. It was in the 2000s. And that at that time, I don't think any pharmaceutical company had come up with a weight loss drug.
Right.
They were working on it. Everybody wanted one. But a common recommendation when you think about lifestyle changes include weight loss. Usually,
Right.
that's kind of the first recommendation. Although weight loss isn't a recommendation for folks that are in smaller bodies, right? Who have these conditions, because these type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, hypertension, these are conditions that happen regardless of the size of your body. And so weight loss isn't considered a treatment for those individuals.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's a common conversation. It's a conversation that I think, if you would agree, or your listeners would probably realize, or like the conversation of the need to lose weight in our country is an ongoing conversation.
Of course. And my other question was, for you personally, has nutrition, or I should say eating, or any of that aspect been something that you yourself have struggled with or looked at, in terms of just, personalizing it? Because I feel like, I know for me, that topic has a lot of meaning and triggers at the same time, because I have struggled in that area, and, still have days, still have whatever, have times, but I feel like, I just think it's, something that a lot of people can relate to. And I'm just curious for you, if that's something that, you yourself were like, oh my gosh, like, light bulb moments of this one, this was true for me.
For sure. One of the things that I want to say up front is that I think it's really difficult to be a human in our diet-oriented culture. And with all of the nutrition information that we have coming at us all the time, to not have struggled at some point with the way you perceive your body, and that affect your eating in one way or another. And also with regard to health, like wellness culture is kind of a subset of diet culture, and is pretty strong, kind of this idea of optimal health, right? And there being one kind of approach for that. So, certainly as a human on this earth, I have never struggled personally with an eating disorder. But really, when a lot of the kind of clean eating movement happened, that definitely kind of took hold for me, and really made eating really complicated. Like suddenly drilling down and analyzing ingredients, this kind of concept of only eating whole foods, or only, eating things that had less ingredients, and read a lot of the books like Fast Food Nation and Michael Pollan's book, Food Rules, and this a number of the books that were talking about these types of things. And this would have been prior to me going back to school, and it made eating a lot more stressful. You know what we know is not good for us? Stress.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of negative health implications for us. And so I'm always trying to remind my clients that I work with about this, is that the stress that we create by trying to follow complicated food rules has negative consequences on our health. Eating something that we do multiple times a day, if we're fortunate enough to have access to food in that way, we're eating multiple times a day. That's multiple times to put yourself under a lot of stress if we're complicating it more than it needs to be.
That's so true. That's so true. And a great way to look at it. I'm curious for you, what your take is on, let's just say, a healthy relationship with food. I think that's something that, could be looked at on many extremes. You have, someone who maybe avoids food altogether because they're afraid to eat some, or they're afraid to gain weight or they're afraid of whatever. But then you also have people who maybe quote unquote, use food as a way to self-soothe or whatever. I mean, there's so many different scenarios. And yet there's, like I just said to you, before we started, like there's those of us too, myself included, on days where you maybe quote unquote think that your diet is off, or you've just, eaten like crap, that you're going to then punish yourself, whether that's, verbally or mentally or, even physically. I mean, I can remember times, in my early adulthood where I would, turn that into something where I would, get excessive with exercise to try and combat, what I had eaten the day before. I mean, I've learned that that's just ridiculous. You can't, one workout isn't gonna, change everything, but that's what we do, I think. And there's a lot of people listening that can relate to that. I'm curious though, how do we start to develop a better just view of food in general, and maybe what a healthy relationship with the food that we eat, what does that look like?
A healthy relationship with food, I think, is one that, like we just mentioned, it's one that's not stress inducing. It's one that recognizes that your nutritional health is not comprised of one day, 1 week, 1 month, or even 1 year. And that there's going to be seasons where our needs are going to change. I think the pandemic was a great example of that. I am of the belief that one of the ways that we can cope with stress is food. One of the things that can be comforting to us is food. My mother's homemade spaghetti and meatballs is comforting to me. And I think that that's an amazing thing, and that there's worse coping skills for us to use other than food.
True.
And I think that for an individual, they may realize, like, as it is with anything, gosh, I'm using this in a way where I'm not actually ever experiencing my feelings. And that can be different in that person. It's still their choice though. There's no moral obligation, right? So for that individual, if that's distressing, or they feel like there's something that can serve them better at a time in their life where they get to the place where they want to work on that, then they can. But there is a lot of good and bad food language and good and bad body language that is guilt and shame provoking. And I would say a healthy relationship with food is when somebody's able to move away from feelings of guilt or shame or belief that they are bad, internalizing messages that they did something wrong based on the way that they're eating or the way that their body looks.
So good. So good. So how do we, there's so many questions I can go dive into here. How do we start to navigate that? I mean, how do we, I'm saying that because in my mind, I hear you. And I also have this, thing running over in my head, but there are foods that we've been told, aren't helpful, whether it's sugar or excessive alcohol or, whatever it is. And, you have people that are like, I'm more of a believer that, X, Y, and Z is good and X, Y, and Z is bad. But then you have others who think everything in moderation, it's all okay. I'm curious how you approach that with your clients, and because that's a lot to take in. I mean, I think that's, a huge issue for so many of us is the labels that we've put on certain foods. And then, we beat ourselves up because we had pizza and beer the night before or something, and it's like, come on. So I'm curious, like how you even approach that with your clients.
We talk about the term permission giving and being able to give yourself permission, and that making foods permissible. One of the things that I see in most all individuals, which is the reason why we're starting to understand better that like diets and I'm throwing plans in there, things that don't call themselves diets, but are anything that's kind of saying that kind of makes you begin to believe like I'm either on track or off track, or I'm eating good or I'm eating bad. I did good today. or I did bad today, I'll do better tomorrow. Anything that reinforces that thinking for almost all individuals. And studies have shown more than 90%, we're talking around 94% of individuals, when you start to put these practices in place and you lose weight, you eventually regain it. And the reason why is because they aren't sustainable for the long haul and certain foods become forbidden. And so when you eventually inevitably eat cake again, or sugar again, or carbohydrates that you've deemed bad again, what happens in food psychology wise is it tips you over into this place of being like, well, I have messed up. So therefore, in intuitive eating, that's called a Last Supper mindset. And so therefore, I am going to go for broke. Right.
Right.
And so the issue is not so much that somebody has chosen to eat all the food. It's just that they're not really in the driver's seat for that. It's more so the belief that they're going to take it away from themselves again that leads them to this place of eating in this way in the first part. And what I work with my clients on is if foods from cake to kale foods are good and important, then you can connect a whole lot more with what it is that you actually want. And no longer is it, I can't have that because I can't, or I did have that and I don't believe I should. And therefore now I'm just going to eat a whole lot of it. And this creates cycle for individuals. And that cycle can happen within the day of like, I wake up and I'm going to do good today. Like I vow to do good today, but by the afternoon or after dinner, they feel like it's falling apart based on what their motivation was.
Sure.
Or we can see this in longer term cycles of weeks or months. We see this in folks who have like a cheat day on the weekends and then go back to being, back on track during the week. And this cycle, makes us really, really vulnerable to feel out of control with foods at different times, or to eat more guilt or shame motivated than based on what it is our body's actually sharing with us that it needs or wants.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that's got to be a huge part of intuitive eating is not just looking at that from just, all these healthy foods that we've deemed healthy foods as being the only way, but realizing that, I think, if we're aware, I mean, this is kind of my take on it. If we're aware of, a food that we love and maybe it's not, we've somehow been labeled not healthy or whatever, but we're choosing to eat it and we're aware and we're enjoying the moment or whatever it is, you know what I mean? We're not punishing ourselves in the process. I think that's got to be a key. That's just kind of what struck me.
You're right. And you'd asked me in the beginning about a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
And if we think about healthy relationships that we have interpersonally, they're not punitive, right? And so our relationship with food shouldn't be punitive either.
True.
Even if we ate in a way that made us feel really bad afterwards. I know some of your listeners may have experienced something that they would constitute a binge, and maybe they're struggling with it on even a regular basis, or this feeling of like, gosh, I do good in the beginning of the day. At the end of the day, I'm so full and I feel like I've overeaten and I don't understand why this is happening. And the message we get is that it's a lack of self-control. But when I'm trying to paint a picture of like, actually, it's not. It's that, we didn't eat enough. We didn't eat enough foods. We didn't eat enough foods that were satisfying. We were restricting ourselves in some way. And that almost all humans are going to respond, with this physiological and the psychological drive to be able to get the foods that we need. And to be able to practice self-compassion with that and be compassionate about that experience is really essential versus, this more punitive message that we get about messing up with our food. I'm using quotes and quotes here, messing up is per diet culture. Like you mess up the way you're eating. Well, that means that we've kind of created an inflexible plan for ourselves that we can mess up and that we will mess up.
Right. How do you start? Like, what's like a ground-based practice or something that, you start with your clients right away when they come to you and they're unhappy with the way they look, or they think that their relationship with food is messed up, or they have these labels of this is bad, this is good. I mean, how do you even start to help them in that situation?
Twofold, we're obviously having conversations about this language around food and talking about where did those come from, and for some of us, it even came from family.
Sure.
It comes from diet culture. That's where family internalized it, so on and so forth. But in addition to that, there's some practical things with food, and I can give you a link to a framework that your audience can print off. That's because everybody wants to get into the food part, right? And changing that around, but mentality is such a significant part of it. In the practical food part is I always try to help clients make sure that they're eating enough, because everybody feels that they're eating too much. Because what we've all been told, you're only supposed to have 1,200 calories or 1,000 calories or so many calories. And that could not be more untrue. Most of the time, what people think that they should be eating in their head is a lot of times a lot less. And then when they have these eating experiences that make them feel really uncomfortable and distressed and like they messed up, then that's the perception that they're left with. Whereas I'm interested in, are you eating enough food? Are you eating enough foods that you like and actually enjoy, and enough like different types of foods throughout the day? So that's usually where we start, because like I said, it can be really difficult to work on connecting with hunger and fullness if you haven't eaten enough all day. Right? If you've been eating in a restrictive way for a long time, and maybe your hunger cues are diminished and you need to reconnect with them. And so kind of putting in place some regular rhythms of experimenting where, again, I'm not as concerned about what the food is just, is there different types? Are you offering yourself proteins and fats and carbs and fruits and vegetables and fun foods that you enjoy, things like chips or cookies or cake? Chocolate, where is that in your diet? I always tell my clients, if you slipped two what we call dietary recall, like what somebody ate the day before, if you put two in front of me and one of them was fast food all day long, and one of them was salads and lean proteins all day long, I would be equally as concerned with both of these. Neither of these are giving you an opportunity to experience different types of foods. Right? Neither of these are something that are what we might say is like balanced. You're not giving your body enough access to different things. Both of these things matter, but both of these, I'm going to give a side eye to that.
Right.
In both cases.
Right. What about someone who thinks that though, and I know this is definitely a diet mentality, but they think I'm just going to restrict myself, with, let's just say, carbs and sugar, because I know a lot of people do that, and till I get to, this weight or X, because I think that's a mentality that a lot of people, in the fitness and nutrition realm embrace is, you have to restrict here for a while, not forever, but, until you get to this point and you establish this base, and then you can go back. I mean, I'm just curious what your take is on that, because I think that can be very confusing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wouldn't recommend it.
Yeah.
I'm like, if it's something that you enjoy and you like, if it's something that you enjoy, then, and you don't imagine like being away from now until you're 95, then you shouldn't be finding places to restrict it short term because of, what this contributes to. It's like like one of those Newton's cradle pendulums. I usually keep one around, but my daughter got it all tangled up. It's like the more you pull back on one side, when you release it, it's momentum. I mean, it's going to swing the other direction on the pendulum. That's what you see people do a lot of times. They'll be like, I'm done with the no sugar, the no carbs thing. And then they're having the opposite experience because now they've given themselves permission to do so. It's a pseudo permission because they They don't know when they're going to
Sure.
do this again and have to take it away. Right. So you may as well do it up. Right. And
Sure.
so it's a normal thing to have it go higher on the other side. If somebody wants to eat all the things, I want them to be able to do that and make that choice and not do it because they're like, I feel so deprived of this that I have to, like, I feel propelled to,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And so the intuitive eating part, do you look at that in terms of just like honing in on what your body is craving, like really focusing in, being present to whether it's, salt or something sweet or just the fact that I don't feel full and I'm hungry, or if is it true hunger or is it maybe I just need to drink water or is it, you know what I mean? There's a lot of things.
Yeah, it's being able to connect to what your body's saying and then also being able to trust it. And I think that's the hardest part because
That's so true.
We get a message constantly that we should be disconnecting from our body, and really not just with food, but in a lot of places. But we get that a lot. Like never is any diet saying, and if your body says you're hungry, then you should have more, when that's actually what hunger means. That's what made our babies cry when they needed food, is they felt hunger within their body. They cried. We responded. They stopped when they were done. We were born with this. The difficult part is that we have been given so many external cues through the years. Another one, I know you kind of mentioned it there with water. Like, is it true hunger? Hunger only means that we need more food. It just does. We can put things in our body. I could swallow packing peanuts and no longer feel hunger, but it doesn't mean that I responded. And that's a diet culture thing. A lot of times to say, you might not actually be hungry. You might actually be bored, or you might actually really need water. I'm like, no, well, we have thirsty to let us know when we need water.
True.
We have hunger to let us know when we need energy, not a diet food product that does not have energy in it, like a diet soda or something, but it needs energy. Now, there's anything wrong with drinking a diet soda. I'm saying it's not the same thing. Their body needs energy when it's hungry. Sure. And that when we can respond to that, then our body will continue to communicate. So even just being able to trust that hunger is hunger, being able to respond to that. And that can be particularly challenging for folks that are being told that their body's not right by messages, by our culture.
So true. That's so true. That's so true. I'm curious about your take on, the whole topic of body shaming too, because I feel like that goes so hand in hand with, the diet culture, with thoughts about ourselves. And I really do believe that probably at some point, most everyone listening, has either experienced some sort of body shaming from someone else or something that they've said, internally to themselves. I think sometimes we are our own worst critic, our own worst body shamers, so to speak. I mean, I could definitely say that for myself. And I'm sure, others of you listening and can relate to that. But I know that has to be such a huge topic that you address. And I feel like we're starting to, in our culture, I feel like we're starting finally to understand that there is no one size that is acceptable or beautiful or the image of health. I mean, I am so grateful that so many companies are starting to wake up to that, and they're not using the same size model, the same size, whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with anyone that looks that way. I'm just saying we're, as human beings, in a world, we're all different shapes and sizes, and it's not one body type that is better than the other. And I've bought into that for years, decades, and it's so detrimental. And I'm watching it now with my teenage daughter, and it's equally as disturbing.
It is, because it affects our self-worth. We internalize a message of, I can't show up in life in these big ways,
Yeah.
into my calling, in front of people. If I don't fit, nobody will take me seriously unless my body looks a certain way. And there are some actual limitations in our society because it has not caught up for folks in larger bodies. But the overall message that we get is really fear generating. We call it fat phobia, and it can be really harmful. And it dictates a lot of these decisions about food because we're either trying to lose weight or we're afraid that we'll become larger than we are now. And that fear is a strong driver with food behavior, but also, as I know your audience is women, but I do believe it's affecting our men and boys as well. It's really affecting all genders, and it really affects it can really impact the way we show up in our lives. We may choose not to do something because of our body size. And that's where I feel like as a society, we're also really losing out. We're losing out on brilliance and genius and talent because this narrative is so strong, and it's causing people to hold back.
That's so true. That's so true. How do we start to maybe just address that in our own lives and become more aware?
One of the things that I think is most helpful outside of like doing some individual body work is finding folks who are in larger bodies, who are on social media, who are putting themselves out there, who are showing themselves, because we have a lot of negative images that we internalize about body sizes. And this is regardless of your body size that you have. This is helpful because the reality of it is that we see implicit and explicit messaging and visuals of, it's usually people in fat bodies whenever there's a news segment that's addressing weight at all. And you see them with their heads cut off, like their heads aren't even there. They're always in a fast food restaurant. Like you're not seeing folks in larger bodies doing things that folks in larger bodies can do, like run and walk and hike and dance. And that's something I can send you a link to also. I'd have to figure out how to link it over to you, maybe a PDF, but I do have a list of accounts that oftentimes I'll give folks to follow, because just seeing images of folks in larger bodies, noticing how that makes us uncomfortable, maybe even allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable, asking ourselves where this comes from, and kind of challenging some of our own implicit biases around weight, can do volumes for the way we view our body and the way we view others' bodies, which affects how we view our body. And it's a real practical thing that if you can fill your Instagram feed with folks that are in different sized bodies, it comes back to representation. Like you're mentioning before, we're starting to see some more representation in Old Navy's one recently. The sizes still aren't going up as high as I'd like to see them, but we're starting to see more representation, but it's helpful. And we have to, as individuals, choose to go out and find it, because most of it's not going to just kind of land on our TV show or in our social media feed unless we're looking for it.
That's so true. That's so true. I think one of the things that comes to mind that I'm reminded of, is that, health is health. It's, how we feel. It's, how our bodies are functioning, how we're moving, whether we're able to do the things that we want to be doing. How do we actually feel? It's not just the outward appearance. And I know for myself, when I've seen, whether it be an ad or if you see, a picture of somebody who's run a marathon and they're not, quote, the type of body that you would think a marathon runner would look like, you might think to yourself, well, that person, that's amazing that they can do that, but they still need to lose weight, or they still need to, but that's got to be so, it's, couldn't be further from the truth. And I feel like that's the challenge that we have to start recognizing, I think, is we've been so cultured to think that person's unhealthy. They must have an eating problem. They must not be able to, they must eat like crap if they're running and they still look like that. I mean, I just think it's the conditioning that we've unfortunately been brought up with.
Yes. And it's still so pervasive that, like I said, we actually have to we have to choose to challenge it. There's books that have been written to by different folks. One of my favorites is Things That No One Will Tell Fat Girls by Jess Baker. And, there's books that are written that can be also helpful. I do believe like seeing images that are different is one of the most impactful. But listening to things that are challenging this line of thinking, and really, regardless of the size of body that you are in, it is beneficial. But if you're listening right now and you're in a larger body, it can be so incredibly validating that you don't have to change your body to be healthy, and you don't have to change your body in order to, begin taking steps towards doing some of the things that you want to do. Right. For the most part.
That's so true. Yeah. That's so true. Before I wrap up with two questions, there's something else that really popped in my mind that I wanted to say is, I think that there are a lot of women, no matter what size, maybe because I feel like that's all, once again, it's our perception. I mean, there's women who are listening in who I might look at and say, you don't have a problem. Like you look great, but they don't like the way they look. Or there's someone who's, larger, in a larger body or whatever. And they're struggling because they feel like they're trying to, get on track with their health, get on track with their diet, whatever. And in the process, they're still looking at it in terms of, when I reach this point, then I will be happy. Then I will live. I'll, everything will be so much better because I will be in this body, or I will have, be fitting in these jeans or this or that. And then I can love myself. That's what I'm saying, is I feel like that's such a struggle for so many of us to just love ourselves in the process. And it's so easy to look at someone and be like, well, it's easy for you. And it's not, look at you or look at that, but I feel like it's across the board. It doesn't have to be someone in a larger body or a smaller, you know what I mean? I just feel like that's a huge struggle. And I'm curious how you even address that, or what your take is on that.
Yeah, I think kind of what I hear you saying is that thin does not equal happiness. Like even when we arrive, it's really the messages that we get about our bodies needing to change. And we see, again, the other types of images of thinner people being happier, living these great exuberant lives are the messages that we're, fed. Right. Is that getting to this number that's in your head, that is the number that you feel like you want to be at, does not necessarily result in that happiness. And it gets complicated because then our society values that, and they are giving you attention, right? And that can feel really good, but normally there is something else that we're really looking for, and the weight is a distraction. We call it the Great Distractor in our field, because there's usually, even in that moment, it might be distracting you from a feeling. If you're walking around the house putting things away, and all of a sudden you get this bad body image thought. And a lot of times I can walk a client back and be like, what was going on before then? I'm like, oh, well, I just hung up with my mom and had this, complicated conversation. So it's never really about the body. That being said, because we live in a society that is weight biased and has I'm in a smaller body, and because of that, I recognize that there are certain privileges that I have. I never have to worry if I'm going to fit into a seat, right? I never have to worry if they're going to have clothes in sizes that fit my body. There are some really practical things that are privileges that in our society for being smaller, because our society hasn't caught up to accommodating all bodies, right? And I want to just name that and validate for anybody that's listening out there that has to face those real life struggles. But that being said, there's people out there, a lot of folks out there that are choosing to pursue happiness apart from this belief of like, well, if I get thinner, then everything will get better. Well, again, these are some logistical things that I think are ridiculous barriers in our society for folks because of their body size. However, that doesn't result in happiness in your life, right? And so I want to honor the fact that there are differences in the way that we're treated in our society based on our bodies. Nobody's coming up to me telling me about what I should and shouldn't be eating when I'm eating cake at a restaurant, right? That thing happens. Discrimination happens for folks in larger bodies. That being said, weight loss doesn't, and avoiding that doesn't result in happiness either. Like it doesn't mean, even though you have the relief of those barriers, that you are going to become happier.
So true. So true. Such great wisdom. Okay. My final two questions. Just love this conversation. Tell me 3 words that best describe who you really and truly are.
Honest, loving, an advocate.
Love that. So important. Love those words.
Yeah.
And my last question, how do you strive to embody greatness in your own life?
Probably through those things, those 3 words I just mentioned. I think advocating where I have the energy and the capacity for a lot of things that we're talking about here. Those show up in a lot of different little places in my life, and advocating for our kids and for women to be able to be free, be able to be free from these burdens and therefore be emboldened in their work and their life, whatever that is for them. And I think that I've lost your question now, but I think that the 3 words that I mentioned answer it.
And yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, embodying greatness is, yes. I mean, for sure. Those are great. Well, Meagan, thank you so much again for being here. I love what you've had to share. I think you've opened my eyes, and I'm sure many who are listening to, I think, just a different perspective and a different way of approaching diet and health and all of it. And I just really commend you for the work that you're doing in the world. I think it's amazing. I think it's so needed. I think there's so many women and lives that you're touching by just, shedding light on something in a different way. That's, I think, very unique than an approach that I think a lot of people are taking. And I think it's one, though, that really fosters the whole idea of loving ourselves more and on being more of who we truly are, and not being so bogged down by what society is telling us we need to be or look like, or all of those things. So thank you so much for that, and for sharing your wisdom, and for just being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And thanks for sharing me with your audience.
Of course.